Just can't even get through.
We are live.
Can we get this?
We are live. Yeah.
We are live.
I'd like to call the meeting to order. Agenda item number 1, A&R AOE BDH request for PCB mitigation funding for Act 178 of 2022. I'd like to invite Secretary Moore and Secretary French up to present.
Good afternoon. So I don't know if the intention is to share the slides on the screen. Should I pass out hard copies?
They have hard.
Oh, they already have them?
Yeah.
Perfect. I brought extras.
We are well staffed,
All right.
very well staffed.
Excellent. So I thought just taking a moment to sort of review why we're doing this work, and then we'll come to you with the specific ask. But this is an initiative around looking for PCBs in indoor air in schools. PCBs are polychlorinated biphenyls, and they were last produced in the late 1970s. But obviously we have old and older school buildings. So there's a high likelihood that these chemicals could be in some of the materials. And we know that nationwide, between 1930 and 1979, about 1.5 billion pounds of PCBs were produced. And these are things we're concerned about in concentrations of parts per million, parts per billion. So billions of pounds is a lot of PCBs in the environment. Monsanto was really the sole producer of these chemicals in the US. And we can talk more about that in a little bit. But they were banned in 1979 because they're found to be persistent, meaning they don't break down quickly, and they also bioaccumulate, meaning they can travel up the food chain. We have known cancer and non-cancer risks, and in fact, PCBs is one of the few chemicals that's actually been labeled a known carcinogen as opposed to a probable carcinogen. So because PCBs were so widely used, devilishly useful, you might say, they were in caulking and paint, the ballasts and fluorescent lights, window glazing, ceiling tiles, almost any application you can imagine. And so we know inevitably they are in our institutional and commercial buildings. In the summer of 2019, as part of a planned renovation at the Burlington High School, we did bulk material testing. And really that's a step we require for most large demolition projects. So you know where the waste material needs to be disposed of. And we're generally looking for things like asbestos and PCBs in doing this testing. In the summer of 2020, Burlington Schools notified us that they found significant PCB concentrations, both in building materials and in the soil samples collected outside of at least one of their buildings. And they attributed those PCB levels in the soil to the building materials sort of breaking down over time. We requested indoor air sampling upon receiving those results. And in early September, we received preliminary data with very high numbers, very concerning numbers, particularly in Building F, which is the tech center at Burlington High School. And on September 10th, the district made the decision to have all classes go remote. So this raised concerns, obviously, that similar conditions could exist in other school buildings in Vermont. Historically, we weren't really thinking about PCBs in indoor air. Diet was assumed to be the place people received most of their exposure to PCBs as they worked their way up the food chain. But we know that the kinds of levels that we're seeing in Burlington School can contribute more exposure than diet alone. And so testing indoor air and then working to remediate the sources we find is really going to be an important set of steps to reduce exposure. The way we're approaching this testing in public schools is that A&R has hired consultants to do this indoor air testing. Sampling at each school is intended to be representative. That means we're not sampling every room, but we've grouped like rooms based on the time when they were built or renovated, and then are sampling one in each of those representative cadres. We have worked with the health department to create a temporary occupancy framework to provide guidance on how schools can react if PCBs are detected. And then we are helping schools when action levels are exceeded in a manner consistent with our IRule standards. The I rule is shorthand for the investigation and remediation of contaminated properties rule. And this is an established framework that ANR uses looking at any contaminated property. It has a set of requirements around investigation and then the corrective actions that need to be taken when there's been a release of hazardous materials. And PCBs in indoor air is defined as a release. So this includes thinking about the source and the extent of the contamination, and then doing an alternatives analysis to identify the most cost-effective solution for mitigating, treating, or removing the contamination. So as part of Act 74 of 2021, the legislature committed about $4.5 million to DEC to do this indoor air testing. And then the health department derives screening levels, school action levels, and immediate action levels to prioritize the need when PCBs are detected. The overall goal obviously is to keep PCBs in indoor air in schools as low as possible, but we also know that there are background concentrations. And so the screening level is intended to say there's something up here above and beyond what we would expect under normal conditions. The school action level believes we have identified a source that will ultimately need to be remediated. And an immediate action level means that those rooms are no longer safe for occupancy. So testing began in June of this year. We've received results back for 6 schools at this point. 2 of them, the Oak Grove School in Brattleboro and Cabot schools, had results in 1 or more rooms that exceeded either the school action level or the immediate action level, and therefore require prompt attention. We have at least 6 other schools, and I believe we're now at 8, where those air canisters are at the lab awaiting analysis. And we are also in the process of standing up our own testing capacity at the Ag and Environmental Lab down in Randolph to hopefully start to expedite the processing of some of these samples. So once we get back these results, there are several steps that can be taken. The first is mitigation, and those are really immediate measures trying to offset negative effects. And a lot of those in schools or in any commercial or institutional setting really are thinking about air handling. So either increasing ventilation or providing air filtration. Mitigation is often accompanied with investigation and materials testing. We need to make sure we know what the source of it is. The air handling pieces are a temporary fix, but ultimately we need to identify the materials and see that they're removed or sort of covered in place. And generally, the cost for that additional investigation work runs between $30,000 and $75,000 per building. A little bit of it depends on how many rooms and how many sort of different sets of circumstance we believe are contributing to the PCB levels. So within Act 178 of 2022, which is what brings us here today, there's an allowance for an amount of up to $2.5 million to be made available for the purposes of responding to the presence of PCBs in schools once detected. And so we are here to seek authorization, a fairly narrow authorization for 2 key activities. The first is state-led purchasing of some supplies, in particular, some of these fan and filtration systems that we believe could be deployed immediately to help mitigate PCB concentrations. And then the second is to provide cost share for the additional investigation and required materials testing that's needed to permanently remediate PCBs in schoolrooms. Both of these steps need to be taken as quickly as possible in order to get to that permanent solution, which is remediation. And then in the next slide, it speaks to what remediation is. But this could be permanent upgrades to air handling systems, encapsulating suspected PCBs with paints or mastics or other materials. But most often it involves removing and properly disposing of those materials. Recognizing that's often work best done during the summer, these mitigation measures also provide a bridge between when conditions may be found and when they can ultimately be remediated. And as you probably recall, ANR and AOE and BDH are drafting a plan for the balance of that PCB reserve, the $32 million that's held in the Ed Fund that will be delivered to you by January 15th of next year. Just in terms of where we're going, we are sort of in the ramp up space and anticipate getting to a place where we're testing 30 to 40 schools per quarter, so about 3 a week, between now and June 30th of 2025. There are, by our count, our best count, 351 schools statewide that will need to have this testing done, meaning they were either built or significantly renovated prior to 1980. We are working with schools with results above those action levels to develop remediation plans consistent with the iRule standards. We're working on those recommendations to bring back to the legislature for the balance of the PCB reserve. And then we're here today seeking e-board authorization for the $2.5 million to fund those specific activities, the state-led purchasing of key supplies and providing cost share to schools to conduct additional investigation. And then the final slide in your packet is the proposed motion to allow authorization of these funds. And we've worked with finance and management as well as the Joint Fiscal Office to make sure that this language meets the needs of those who will be responsible, not only for utilizing the funding in our agencies, but tracking the utilization of those funds.
Any other, are you going to be adding anything to this or?
Not in terms of background, but I'm certainly available if you have any questions on the operational side.
Any questions?
I have a question, not about what you're doing here, but just something you said made me wonder. Air handling is something that we've been dealing with a lot with COVID, and I'm just curious, where are these things crossing over? Are we able to take advantage of what we've been doing in terms of getting schools open?
Yeah, we had a meeting this morning with some of the superintendents. This very question came up. I mean, on the broad sense, we're endeavoring to improve HVAC capacity in all our schools as a result of COVID. And then very specifically, we had deployed some HEPA filters, but you had the question this morning to just sort of draw the distinguishing piece between these filters and others. So maybe
Correct. So the specific types of filters we're looking for are granular activated carbon or GAC filters, and they bind up organics like PCBs. That said, sometimes those filters aren't necessary. It's simply increasing the throughput of air circulation. And so one of the things we're anticipating, honestly, is as we're doing this testing, that some schools may not have a turn up the HVAC system option left because they have maximized what their system is capable of to respond to concerns around COVID and indoor air quality.
And that was a contention with Cabot. You know, they recently retested when their original testing happened this summer. Their air handling system was not on in the gym, and they've seen much lower rates now that they tested with the system running. So
The system, yeah.
But of course, the community got the first version.
Absolutely.
It's more serious, and it's hard to say with the change in testing,
Right.
you know, what the impact was.
But going forward, we'll be pulling that information together with
Absolutely.
each of
And,
the
you know,
schools.
it just underscores the
Yeah.
complexity of this, not only from a technical standpoint, but the communications piece is equally complex.
I think the communications piece is certainly critical. One of the questions, or you had mentioned the state's going to have its own capacity to do the testing at the lab. That would reduce turnaround time from what to what, and it's a more cost effective as well, I assume, or maybe not.
So I'm not sure we have the final answer on that yet because we haven't started the testing. Certainly we'll have a higher degree of control, in particular in our own ability to prioritize samples. And so the plan right now is to use our lab capacity for those confirmation samples and then samples that might be collected once a mitigation measure is deployed to confirm that they're actually having the intended outcome. We are also looking, we currently have contracts with 2 labs to conduct the testing of these canisters and are looking to add a contract with a 3rd lab with the hope that we can accelerate the cycle time in getting results back.
And if I could, you've mentioned it a couple of times, but I want to underscore how really important this report on how to allocate this money going forward is going to be. It's significant piece of work for all of you, but it really does make a difference in trying to decide how we prioritize the spending of that money. So I'm glad that you're working on it. I just want to underscore that.
The other part is more accelerated getting the results, because people have been concerned, gee, if I'm ending up in year 3 and the money's gone, what are we going to be kind of,
That's all part of that
so,
prioritizing. Yeah.
so having the ability to accelerate that testing and get the results helps kind of reduce that fear that I'm going to be at the end and the money has gone elsewhere.
Yeah, and we did go to some effort with the health department to try to develop a set of criteria for prioritizing schools. So we believe we are sampling sort of the highest risk schools first based on construction timing, and then also schools with younger students where PCBs pose a greater health risk. So we've worked to prioritize schools based on those 2 criteria, but you're right, there's a lot of unknowns in this space.
Sure.
And I had forgotten, does the report also talk about a communication plan, or are you thinking about that separately?
I think currently that's a separate issue, and it's one the Agency of Education will probably step in and provide more leadership on, kind of like what we did in COVID, developing guidance. Our concern is we're getting a better handle on the complexity of this, is the impact on school operations. So we want schools to be planning ahead of time so they can understand how they might have to redistribute their classes and so forth. So we can maximize kids being in person, especially after the pandemic. But I think our homework, if you will, for January is really to describe how to address the equity issues and allotting a finite source of funds to address the mitigation.
I suspect that there will be communication issues even around that. And so
Sure.
trying to be on top of that and anticipating it, I think will make the whole process so much smoother.
Yes, agreed.
It was a bit rocky with Cabot.
Yes. I think it's important to keep the perspective that this isn't just new work to the state of Vermont. This is pretty much new work to the country. And so there aren't a lot of opportunities for us to glean lessons learned from some of our peer organizations in other states. I think they're watching us and hoping to learn from what we take away from this effort. But as a result, it makes a very complicated program all the more challenging.
Can you give us a bit of a view as to how the testing is done procedurally in a school, whether it's Cabot or a much larger school? I'm just thinking, we talk about the turnaround of the sampling, but I think that's just a small piece of the puzzle. The actual testing itself takes some time.
It does. So first, a consultant will visit the school, use it to the extent they're available, any of the building plans, and do that work of trying to group like rooms and likely expected sources of PCBs. Once they've done that work, they will come back and deploy. I call them canisters. I think if you in your mind can picture a radon test, it's not unlike what this looks like. So you're putting a device out in the room to sort of get a sense over a set period of time what the concentrations of the PCBs are in indoor air. Once we receive those results back, if they exceed one of these action levels, then we come back into the room and start to look at the likely material sources. So PCB light ballasts are a very common one. Window caulk, for some reason, has remarkably high concentrations of PCBs in several applications we've seen to date. Can also actually be in the HVAC system if it's been in some of those other building materials and the system hasn't been cleaned. So that important third step, which is the place where some of these resources would be deployed, is that more detailed site-specific evaluation where we're looking for the likely sources of PCBs and can either test for them or remove them outright.
About how many people does it take to do this kind of a testing and the duration?
Sure. So I think it depends a little bit on the size of the school. Generally, my understanding is these consultants are going out in small teams, 2 to 6 individuals, to do the assessment and deploy and then recollect the canisters. But I'm sure there are bigger teams that may go out to larger schools.
And are we challenged just like in every other sector in Vermont in terms of having the workforce to do this?
Yes, so as you may recall, we had proposed to start the sampling in April of this year and immediately hit the ground running with 30 to 40 schools being sampled a quarter. That's proved just impossible. And a portion of that is sort of challenges within state government to spin this work up. But a significant component of that is capacity within the consulting community to do this testing. We do have these retainer contracts with consultants. But I also expect, and frankly, we heard from Cabot this morning, some challenges of when they did get their results back that exceeded the action level, finding a contractor to work with them on the testing, and then ultimately the remediation was also challenging. So we know that this is something that we're going to be need to be very aware of and help manage throughout.
In my weekly report this week from education, I saw that Cabot, it was the air handler that wasn't on. Is it because the air handling, we don't run those year round when there's nobody there, the air handling just doesn't come on, they don't activate it?
Yeah,
right?
and I would say, those conclusions are hypothetical, or if they're local ones, like, we're waiting for more scientific confirmation of that. They also have identified some potential sources of contamination, which they I think are likely. But it just underscores the complexity of these programs. I mean, all of the above, we're not sure. But it's something certainly I don't think was anticipated when they went in the summer.
But there's still a source of PCBs.
That's right.
I mean, that's the bottom line,
Right.
regardless of the air handling.
Correct. I think what it does is if the air handling system is able to knock those concentrations down, it provides more time in
Yeah.
order to implement the solution.
So
So
that's a critical piece for operations, because if we can have more time to manage that in the schools, then we can find alternative classroom spaces and so forth and then we can schedule remediation in the
Right.
summer when no one's around. It's a buying time, and that's to underscore why these funds are critical for us to be able to create more time to manage the operations.
So shifting gears slightly, I've read that at least one school district is taking Monsanto to court. And it does occur to me sitting here that having a whole lot of little suits all around the state is probably not very efficient. So I hope that at some point we think about maybe a state initiative in this direction. So I'll just throw that out on the table. Good, that's great, that's good to hear.
I think we did with PFAS.
But we're not here to address that today.
No.
Yeah, well, I was being very circumspect.
So you would like a motion?
Anyone so willing?
I'll move the motion that, you want me to read it?
No.
No.
Anyone would like it read?
Well, then I'll move it if I don't have to read it. The motion that's been presented to us, which authorizes the use of this $2.5 million that's been outlined by the agency.
Second.
Second.
Is there any further discussion? Motion has been made and seconded. All those in favor, signify by saying aye. All those opposed? The ayes have it, and you've passed agenda item number 1. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for your work. Thank you.
I'll take up agenda item number 2, a request for supplemental LIHEAP funding. I'd like to invite Commissioner Chen and LIHEAP Program Director Richard Giddings to present. Welcome back.
Thank you, Governor Scott, and honorable legislators, thank you for the opportunity to present to the emergency board proposal that will mitigate the effects of our skyrocketing heating costs on the lowest income providers. So for background, I don't need to spend a lot of time on background. LIHEAP is our Vermont's low income home assistance program. It's federally funded, and it's a benefit to income eligible Vermonters. The cutoff point is 185% of federal poverty level. The Vermont typically receives a block grant of $21 million, provides a benefit to approximately 20,000 households. The benefits for households who heat with oil, kerosene, propane, gas, electricity, and coal will be sent directly to the fuel dealers, while the benefits for households who heat with wood or pellets goes directly to the households. At that point, the household is found eligible. Approximately $3 million annually from the LIHEAP fund is awarded to OEO in a swap that allows weatherization assistance. The swap allows administrative funding of the program itself. In addition, there's a base appropriation annually to the Emergency Heating Systems Grant Program, which basically fixes broken or replaces heating units so they can use their LIHEAP benefit. Last year was an unusual year. I think it's important to paint that it's an unusual year for all of us, right? Vermont received a one-time American Rescue Plan Act block grant of $26.6 million in addition to its annual funding. The funding allowed economic services to offer unprecedented average benefit of nearly $1,900, about 520 gallons per household for households with heating with oil, propane, or kerosene. In addition, the average benefit compared to an average benefit about $1,000 in 2021. For households that heated with wood, the economic services moved the actual delivery of the wood to spring, where you could take advantage of better buying power for Vermonters, especially low-income Vermonters. There was also a fall benefit that was to provide wood for newly enrolled applicants. So an additional $3.9 million went of the ARPA LIHEAP funds were to use to scale up home weatherization, understanding that especially for low-income providers, these weatherizations will pay off in terms of benefits to the state for years to come. Some of the money also went to the emergency heating repair and replacement program, again, that repairs heating units that in no heat situations. So in addition to liquidate the funding by the federal deadline, we issued an early season benefit to households that were in the lower tier of our income eligibility, 128% of federal poverty, that would allow them to fill their tank earlier in the season. So this year, I think it doesn't escape anyone in this room that fuel prices are skyrocketing. So the average cost is estimated to be $4.81 per gallon. And should we continue with at the same level of funding, that would really provide 175 gallons, which would barely fill a tank. And some fuel dealers were reluctant actually to fill at that low level of so this compares to fiscal year 2019, where the fuel prices were $202.57 per gallon. And actually going back to 21, it's almost double the price of 2021. At that time, that benefit did purchase about 278 gallons of fuel. Luckily, again, I think everyone has been saying this time and time again this fall that we're appreciative of Senator Leahy and the Appropriations Committee for providing an additional $5.7 million to LIHEAP funding through the Consolidated Appropriations Act. So in the end, this was a great benefit to us, but in the end, the Department for Children and Families requesting $5.8 million to protect Vermonters this winter. This will be a total budget of $35,066,942 for state fiscal year 23. That will serve 20,000 households. 4.3 million of this will go to enhance LIHEAP benefit. 500,000 will enhance the emergency heating systems grant, and 1 million will go for crisis fuel program funded by the Community Action Agency. So our partners in providing assistance to low-income providers. So what it buys for consumers are a benefit of approximately 275 gallons. We'll have additional purchase power of 36%. Well, this will pay for 36% of households' heating costs. For households at or below 128% of federal poverty level, it will provide This benefit will provide 53% of a household's heating costs. In addition, we will augment the emergency heating systems grant program for a total budget of $1.25 million. The crisis fuel program will have a total budget of $3 million for state fiscal year 23. So this, I have included in the back of the memo, the language needed for our proposed motion to augment the LIHEAP program in Vermont, acknowledge and mitigate the effects of the skyrocketing fuel prices and allow low-income providers to stay warm this winter.
Questions?
Yes, please. Dr. Chen, you mentioned that there's been the effort to weatherize the homes that are using this benefit. And that's a wonderful initiative we've been engaged in. How much progress are we making on that? It's always been frustrating to me that we're spending this money potentially on unweatherized homes. Do you have a sense of where we are?
Sure, yeah, we, households that are LIHEAP eligible are automatically eligible for the weatherization, and we make referrals to the Office of Economic Opportunity, who of course then puts them out to their 5 weatherization programs around the state. They do prioritize them. They also received some additional funding last year to ramp up those programs across the state, and they're working off the list that we provide them, as well as folks that apply on their own.
Are 20% of the homes weatherized that receive LIHEAP or 90%? Do we have any?
I don't know that.
Yeah.
I don't know that, but I can certainly ask.
It would be an interesting one to track and just to see if we're being effective at the deployment of those weatherization funds for this population.
Sure, last week.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I'm willing to make the motion pursuant to the authority that we have to do exactly what this motion says, and that's 5.8 million in general fund appropriated to the agency. What this would do then is allow the money to be refilled and replaced in the future. So I would move that we appropriate the 5.8 million in general fund from the Secretary's office, your former office, from Global Commitment Appropriation, reduce that appropriation and transfer it to DCF for the home heating fuel assistance and LIHEAP appropriation for FY23. And then we'll reappropriate the money in the Budget Adjustment Act.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any further discussion? All those in favor of the motion that's been made, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? The ayes have it. And we approve agenda item number 2. Thank you both very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now I entertain a motion to adjourn.
Oh, second. Oh, you seconded. I beg your pardon.
Go ahead. All those in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Ayes have it, and we have adjourned. Thank you very much for your good work.
And are we off live?
So, because it kicked me out. It kicked you out, kicked me out. Just end it.